When in Rome, do like the Romans, they say. Well, if you're in Rome today, that would mean you speak Italian. If you were in Rome at the time of the Caesars, you would speak Latin. And if you're in eternal Rome, that is the church, you should also speak Latin. Although you might not think that, based on how some of eternal Rome's citizens talk day to day. Didn't Latin go the way of the dodo? Wasn't this dead language buried at Vatican II? Quite the opposite. Let's open up this case file, the case of the Vulgar Mass. Christ called the church a shining city set on a hill. Today, cities just kind of peter out, or they run into each other, merging into a single massive conurbation. But in Christ's time, cities had walls, for protection and defense mostly. Those walls separated what was inside of them from what was outside. Cities were distinct, set apart, separate. The church is like that, and so are her most sacred things. That is really how something is shown to be sacred. It is used only for holy things, and it isn't used for anything else. If it's some kind of common object, like a cup or a plate, used in a sacred rite, then a special, sacred one of a particular design is made and used exclusively. That is where we get the chalice and the paten. Nobody would use a chalice to serve Coca-Cola, and no one would use a coffee mug for the precious blood. Well, at least I hope not. And that applies to language too, not just a particular formal jargon used to speak of objects and ideas specific to Catholicism. Words like Eucharist, Sacrament, Cardinal, but a whole actual language set aside to be exclusively used for religious ceremonies, discussions, and documents. And that language is Latin. Oh, come on, what is this, the Middle Ages? No one speaks Latin anymore, it's a dead language, right? Well, that's true. But did you ever stop to think what dead language actually means? What makes a living language, well, living? Living to a linguist means it's changing as people speak it. They adopt new slang, which is totes on fleek, if you ask me. Words change their meaning. You can have a gay old time with that, and the spelling of words changes, which can lead to people harboring a grudge. All of this means that after a few centuries, the language is unintelligible. Now, if you don't believe me, pick up a copy of the Canterbury Tales or Beowulf. These poems were written in English, but you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone outside of a university faculty who can read them without a dictionary at his elbow. Heck, for that matter, for those of us of a certain age, pick up a teen magazine or tune into whatever the equivalent of MTV is these days. You can understand it, but it certainly isn't your grandmother's English. A dead language doesn't change. In that sense, calling it dead is kind of like calling God himself dead. He doesn't change either. God doesn't change because he's perfect. Now, Latin's not perfect, nothing but God is, but it's a darn sight better for the church than any other language out there. Why is that? Well, for starters, it doesn't change. So a document written in the 4th century can be read in the 12th or 20th without being misunderstood. When you're writing documents for an organization whose lifespan is measured as until the end of time, that's kinda a big deal. Secondly, it's special, it's separate, it's set apart, it's sacred. Latin isn't really used by anyone other than the church. It is her language. That exclusivity is conducive to piety. It helps lift our minds from the mundane to the sacred. The church is a community set apart for a single purpose, to save men's souls and get them to heaven. The Mass is the most profound means of that salvation. The liturgies of the church are performed in sacred spaces by sacred ministers wearing sacred vestments and using sacred vessels. The actions and words themselves are sacred, set apart from the humdrum of mundane life. It makes perfect sense to have a language set aside for the purpose, a language which isn't used for anything else, a sacred language. Just as you wouldn't use the same plate for nachos and the Eucharist, so too you wouldn't use the same language to discuss a ball game and worship God. Of course, Julius Caesar and his buddies used Latin, right? And while they didn't talk about baseball around the water cooler, they probably chatted about gladiators around the amphora. But they didn't use the same Latin as the church uses. The Romans spoke classical Latin, a rarefied, sophisticated language of politics, poetry, and rhetoric with a strong Greek influence. During the first few centuries of the church's connection with the Roman Empire, a language called ecclesiastical Latin developed. This had a simpler grammar and was free of pagan influences. By the time it reached its maturity around 700 AD, it was the ideal language to discuss theology and perfect for use in the liturgy. It was, without an exaggeration, a language made explicitly for use by the church. So, it's a no-brainer to say church staff should be done in ecclesiastical Latin. It's separate, specific, designed for the purpose, and ideally suited to running an organization that's not about to run out any time soon, we hope. Of course, that doesn't mean the little old ladies running the parish bake sale or the Knights of Columbus selling their Tootsie Rolls to buy an ultrasound machine for the pro-life centre should be doing all of their planning in Latin. No. Rather, it means discussions of theology and, most importantly, the celebration of the liturgy itself should happen in Latin. Let's get down to brass tacks, though. When was the last time you heard any of this? When was the last time you heard Latin itself? Many people, most of them useful idiots, but some knowing full well what they are doing and eager to stop the church from being sacred, from being separate, and instead make her just the same as the rest of our dull, profane, workaday lives. Many people will tell you that Latin is not only dead, but dead, buried, the headstone knocked down, the grave cemented over, and the whole thing forgotten. That happened at Vatican II, they'll say. Oh, brother, have I got news for you. From the document of the Second Vatican Council dealing with the liturgy, the document titled Sacrosanctum Concilium. Wait a second, that doesn't sound English. That almost sounds Latin. Almost as if the official documents of the church are given Latin titles and written in Latin, and that Latin is the official language of the church. Anyway, this Latin titled document, written originally in the church's official language of Latin, says, in English, particular law remaining in force, the use of the Latin language is to be preserved in the Latin rites. All right, the useful idiots are saying, that was Vatican II, but that was a long time ago, and those documents weren't really hard and fast rules, right? They were more suggestions, guidelines, rather than strict orders. I mean, even though there is absolutely no mention of using the vulgar tongue at Mass, it's not as if it strictly prohibited it, is it? What does the Church say now? Well, the Code of Canon Law, the law of the Church, whose official version is written in Latin, says in Canon 980, the Eucharistic celebration is to be carried out in the Latin language or in another language, provided that the liturgical texts have been legitimately approved. And that isn't some medieval text. That isn't even the 1917 Code of Canon Law. This is the current version, issued in 1983. Ronald Reagan was president when this was written. Of course, people will jump on the second half of that sentence, or in another language provided that. And yes, there is nothing illegal about saying Mass in the vernacular, in the vulgar language, as we would say in Latin. The word vulgar means as commonly used, but its meaning has changed in English to mean rude or unpleasant. And you know what? That's probably about right. To use a profane, that is a non-sacred language for the liturgy, when you have access to Latin, is ridiculous. Ridiculous. That word has Latin roots too. It comes from the same place as ridicule. It means something so strange you would only laugh at it. And laugh they did, and by they, I mean the cardinals and bishops when the idea of saying Mass in the vernacular was floated. They laughed, as if the idea was so silly there was no other response. But they wouldn't be laughing now. Because it's not ridiculous to say the Mass in the vulgar tongue when you have Latin. It's terrifying and horrific. Yes, the Church permits it, but merely because something is permitted doesn't mean it's the best or even actively good. And shouldn't we want to offer the best to God? A celebration that separates the sacred from the profane and makes our worship seem special and set apart? Of course, some people will say, all of this is very well for the Tridentine Mass. I mean, that's the Latin Mass, right? Of course, it's in Latin, but the English Mass is in, well, English. Nope. There is no English Mass. There is the Novus Ordo, which is Latin for new form. If the fact its name is in Latin isn't enough for giveaway, the official text of the Novus Ordo is in Latin. It's supposed to be said in Latin. The English versions we have are translations. And guess what? Sometimes they are bad translations. Dominus vobiscum, the Lord be with you. Et cum spiritu tuo, and also with you. What? Even if you don't speak Latin, you can see spiritu has to mean spirit. The proper translation is, and with your spirit. It's a deeper, a more profound expression of the reality of what is being discussed. That change from and also with you to and with your spirit happened recently, and wasn't a change in the words of the Mass. No, it was a correction of a bad translation of the existing Latin words of the Mass. That correction was the most obvious because even non-Catholics have heard that phrase. But what about the prayer that immediately follows the words of consecration of the precious blood? Qui pro vobis et pro multis effundetur. That used to be translated, it will be shed for you and for all. But multis doesn't mean all, it means many, like the word multiple. And while the bad translation doesn't change what is happening on the altar, it changes people's understanding of what is happening there. Yes, Christ died for everyone, he died for all, but not everyone shares in that sacrifice. Not everyone accepts him, not everyone goes to Mass, not everyone will be saved. That single word of bad translation strikes right at the heart of the gospel. It challenges the idea that we need to do something in order to be redeemed by Christ. It makes us sure of our salvation. And when we are certain we will be saved, we can be certain we won't be. Well, there are always going to be problems in translation, right? Languages are living things and they change, and Latin, immortal language, doesn't change. No confusion. Really, those who have objections to Latin can only come up with one objection that isn't immediately exposed as a desire to sneak false, liberal, Protestant influence, man-centered theology past people by using deceptive translations and ambiguous, vulgar words. And that objection is people don't understand Latin. And that's a fair objection, but it's not as if people can't learn it, right? First off, let's remember the Church, with the power to bind and loose, the faithful interpreter of the will of God, the mystical body, and the bride of Christ. She wants us to use Latin. She wouldn't want us to do something impossible. And it's not as if Latin is a language utterly unrelated to anything we speak today. English is Germanic in origin, but many other modern languages, French, Italian, Spanish, Romanian, are Romance languages. Now, that doesn't mean that they're great for chatting up the pretty girl you meet for coffee and donuts after Mass. It means they come from the Roman language, Latin. So, Latin's easier than you think. And let's be honest here. No one is saying the laity should become fluent experts at Latin, but it's equally ridiculous to think they can't or shouldn't memorize a few prayers and get to recognize the rhythms of the language of the Church. People did it for hundreds of years. And come on. Time was, anyone with any education worth mentioning was taught at least a smattering of Latin. The lack of Latin education is a very recent development in Western Europe. But it's hardly fair to expect the laity to learn Latin if the priests aren't taught it, right? It's all very well to ask for the Mass in Latin, but the priests are the ones who have to say it, and they aren't learning Latin, are they? Well, they should be. There is a papal document called Veterum Sapienta, again, a Latin title. This document stresses the importance of Latin in the education and training of priests. It is very, very demanding. It begins by pointing out that we must not forget that the Latin language has a noble and characteristic structure, a precise style, diverse and harmonious, filled with majesty and dignity, which contributes in a singular way to clarity and solemnity. But it doesn't just deal with it in general terms. It goes on to give specific instructions to those charged with the formation of priests. All sacred disciplines must be taught in Latin because the language is the most suitable to explain the profound nature of the sacred mysteries. But surely if people didn't speak Latin, it wouldn't insist on it, right? Actually, it does. It even says that if seminaries don't have the time to devote to Latin studies, then other classes should be cut so that the students can learn Latin. It says no seminarian should be allowed to study philosophy and theology without mastering Latin. Okay, so which pope wrote this? Leo the Great? Pius the I or II? Some Borgia guy back in the Renaissance? No. This was John the 23rd. John the 23rd, who called the Second Vatican Council the Pope the useful idiots and their confused masters love to quote, as if he would support their abandonment of Latin in the so-called spirit of Vatican II. It was Pope John the 23rd who championed Latin, who placed the highest importance on the language in 500 years. Why did he do this? Well, I can't say for sure. I'm not John the 23rd, but perhaps he could see the way the wind was blowing. Certainly, he would have to have been blind to not see the liberal, secular direction the world outside the Church was taking. His intention with the council was to open the doors of the Church up and let her treasures out, to be the light of the world, the salt of the earth, to leaven the whole sorry planet with the gospel. Maybe that didn't work so well. Maybe exactly the opposite happened. But it's clear Pope John the 23rd, the architect of the council, saw the value of Latin. perhaps as a bulwark against the sacred becoming profane. Certainly, that's how I see it. Whatever the reason, I think there are enough good reasons to encourage the use of Latin in the liturgy and elsewhere to call this case closed.